I want to welcome everybody to NAM Center for Korean Studies Colloquium Series this afternoon. I'm really happy to introduce today's speaker. My name is No Jin-Kwak. I'm the director of the NAM Center, and also I'm teaching in the Department of Communication Studies on campus. So I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Professor Haewon Kim. He's a professor of Biblical Studies in the College of Humanities at Sungsil University in South Korea. And he's a really prolific scholar and well-known for his exegesis of the Old Testament and translation of commentaries on the Bible. And he's a chief editor of the International Journal of Christian Studies and author of many, many books, including Modern Humanity and the Bible, and The Kingdom of Acts from the Theology of God's Kingdom, among others. And Professor Kim is well known in Korea on his work and commentary on issues such as social justice, environment, and minority rights, and North Korea. And he has received a PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. He's an ordained pastor, so if his lecture sounds like sermon, that's why. He's giving regularly a sermon on Sunday. And title of today's talk is Disappearance of Prophetic Voice from the Korean Church and its Disservice to Korea. Very provocative title, and it will be a very interesting talk as well. This is about historical and critical analysis of the role of church in contemporary Korea. So please join me welcoming our professor.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to listen to my lecture this afternoon. I'm a little bit excited to be here and also a little bit worried about how can I make myself understood in English. Many people say that I'm eloquent to speak as far as Korean is concerned, but many people don't know how eloquent speaker I am as far as English is concerned. I'd like to thank God as well as everybody at NAM Center here, University of Michigan, for letting me deliver a special lecture at this important colloquium. I consistently will emphasize the prophetic voice for Korean society in general and the Korean church in particular. Why do I emphasize prophetic voice? The prophetic voice is the only channel, only means that will change the Korean church into a transformative church and a society serving church, nation renewing church. My lecture will be about the Korean church has been distorted, tamed into a neoliberal free market totalitarian systems by losing its prophetic stance toward the status quo, especially amid in the early 90s, in the turmoils of the collapse of the Eastern blocs, including USSR. So, as my lecture will turn out to be the case, my lecture is fundamentally 90% is based upon the PPT lecture outline. So, I would like to introduce the content, my lecture here. The distortion of the Korean church after the 1990s. Second, consequence of the rejection of the Old Testament prophet by the Korean church. Three, can Korean society benefit from the Korean church, the prophetic heritage of the Korean church? Who are the ancient Israelite prophets? Section 4 is kind of commentary on section 3. Section 6, the Korean church's regard for the Old Testament prophetic books. Section 7, subverted Christianity or transformative Christianity. Section 8, Christian and society in an ideal tension. Finally, the conclusion. To be clear, I wanted to emphasize, repeat many times, the prophetic voice or prophet. So I wanted to clarify from the very beginning what is the prophetic voice in my context. What is the prophetic voice in this lecture? The prophetic voice is not necessarily something that predicts God's fiery wrath or divine disasters. The prophetic voice must rather be read as a form of social critique of unjust political powers, as well as consolation for the oppressed. This is the definition of a prophetic voice throughout my lecture. So, my definition is based upon 12 Old Testament textbooks, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets in the Old Testament. So, what is the fruit? The Korean church in which prophetic voice will be predominant. The fruit of the prophetic church is well illustrated in Matthew chapter 5, 13 to 16. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for nothing, good for anything, except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Let your light shine before men, so that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Let your light before men. This kind of church, letting their light shine before the people at large. This is kind of a prophetic voice-filled church, serviceable to the great cause of the large society of the world. So, Matthew chapter 5, 13 through 16 is well defined. The characteristics of the prophetic voice predominant church. Let me start the very first section, distortion of the Korean church after 1990s. The Korean church has been distorted, tamed into neoliberal market totalitarian system by losing its prophetic and subversive stance toward the dehumanizing status quo of the early 1990s, which witnessed the collapse of the USSR and the Eastern Bloc. The Korean church began to assert that any socially geared Christian messages should be discouraged, doubted because of their supposed similarities to communist ideology. The Korean church often then distanced itself from the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament and expelled prophetic voices from the Korean society in general and the Korean church in particular. The disappearance of the socio-critical voice from the Korean society, in turn, represented a serious disservice to Korea. Especially the 1997 to 1998 IMF economic crisis dealt a fatal blow to the very foundation of Korean society, unmasking all the negative, dark sides of the rapid economic growth of Korea. To take an example, the rise of unemployment, mass suicide, and divorce crippled Korean society, creating a chasm between the rich and the poor. Most Korean church leaders then jeered at any prophetic outcry on behalf of the IMF created victims and rather marginalized those prophetic Christians' stance by labeling them as communists or North Korean allies. The Old Testament from then time on were systematically removed out of Korean church and were seldom preached or read in the church. Several mega churches in Seoul metropolitan area preached never about Old Testament, let alone Old Testament prophet. Some Korean church, mega church, one time or two times per year preached about Korean Old Testament, especially prophetic text. Consequence of the rejection of the Old Testament prophet by the Korean church. The Korean church deprived itself of a self-critical and self-correcting capacity. The Korean church allowed, naturally, capitalistic principles, competition, monetary incentive for evangelical performance, investment of tithe and offerings on the stock market, to erode its spiritual foundations, especially by awarding individual Christians who excelled at recruiting non-believers to church with the material compensation. Oh, sorry. The Korean church made no effort to curb an inhumane and apathetic neoliberal global economy from dismantling a democratic Korean society. Korean society has not been benefiting from Korean Christianity because the latter has forfeited its paramount charge as light of the world and the salt of the earth. A question rises at this point. Can Korean society benefit from Korean church at all? The recanonization of the Old Testament prophetic books into the Korean church will facilitate the rehabilitation of the Korean church as a beneficial guiding light for the society at large. I do believe the Korean church can function as the light of the world and the salt of the earth, serviceable to Korean society only when it takes heed of the Old Testament prophet voices ringing loud throughout the Old Testament books. The prophetic voice is multivocal, self-reflexive, self-denying, social critical, mediatory, and soul resuscitating. Looking back on 120 years of Korean history, Korean church history, there was time in Korean church when the prophetic voice let itself heard loudly. When? From the late 19th century to the period before the national emancipation from Japanese colonial regime. The history of Korean church is marked by its unfailing enthusiasm for the Bible and the Old Testament prophet in particular. Faced with the decline of their mother country, Korean Christians, less than 1% of the total populace, put their trust in the Old Testament and its bountiful prophecies designed to sustain the people of Israel in their tribulations. Then Old Testament provided the Korean Christian only less than 1% of entire Korean population, with many inspiring lessons and convictions because of its comforting tone and universal vision of a peaceful world full of justice, freedom, and equality. At this point, one may ask questions. Who are the prophet? Who are ancient Israelite prophet? What was their paramount concern? What activity they performed for their contemporary people? These sections will be answered with those questions. Ancient Israelite prophets were individuals who felt themselves divinely commissioned to deliver God's message to the powerful elite and the leadership of Israel. The prophets such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets, etc., were outspoken critics of the corrupt and irreverent ways of the leadership and the Israelite people. Every prophetic book is characterized by bifocal perspectives. The affirmation and justification of divine judgment on the people of Israel and the absolute assurance of the divine restoration and salvation of the people of Israel despite their failure to fulfill their covenantal duties. The ultimate goal of all the Old Testament prophets was to mediate the reign of God into socio-economic and political realms as well as religious ones by delivering social critical oracles to the upper classes, ruling elites, foreign oppressors and tyrants, but also by comforting people oppressed and impoverished due to socio-economic injustice. As well as the fourth century Common Era, the Christian church inherited 39 Old Testament books into the Christian canon itself. The prophetic voice then continued to play a significant role in shaping the church into a society serving and nation building and charitable, egalitarian, self-critical until the very beginning of the medieval period, the 6th century Common Era. Thank you. Now, I'd like to discuss the Korean church's disregard for the Old Testament books in more details. The fact that Old Testament prophetic books have been seldom read and preached in the Korean church account for the failure of the Korean church to perform a prophetic role in the larger society of Korea. The church has failed to be the light and the salt for the Korean society as a whole by being insensitive and disobedient to the prophetic voice of the Bible. The Korean church has failed at performing two major roles of the ancient prophet, proclaiming a judgmental oracle against the ruling elite and the upper classes, and sustaining the weary and the burdened commoners. Now, the Korean church is faced with two options: to deteriorate into a subverted Christianity or transformative Christianity. Stage. How can we reclaim the light and the salt mission of the Korean church? I do argue that Korean church should go back to the prophetic voice of the Old Testament. The Korean church has little
Let's use.
this time. Count down. Okay. Professor Scott, this is last time.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that game stop. I feel like continue, even though. Okay. Okay. Can you? Okay. 80% of Korean church is conservative and deeply aligned with the main ideology of an anti-communitarian, neoliberal, and a free market ideology of Korean society, seldom voicing a social critique against the rampant injustice and inequality in Korea. The Korean church has been so incurably distorted and damaged. The large society of Korea, in turn, should worry about its future, wondering whether the Korean church will survive such a serious corruption and distortion. There are many reasons for the failure of the Korean church to function as light and salt for the large world. Let me mention several reasons. The Korean church is full of superficial, nominal converters, a kind of so-called Constantinian converters. Christian leaders have not been well trained enough to help their fellow Christians bridge the gap between the church life and the secular life. The Korean church has been influenced by late 19th, early 20th century American fundamentalism, whose central tenet is overemphasis on 5 pillar doctrines, such as biblical inerrancy, the birthright of Mary, and substitutionary atonement for the depraved individual, so etc. Whose central tenet in overemphasis on the 5 pillar doctrines and the opposition against any participation of church in economic, political, and societal progress. The regression of the Korean churches in social justice issues is caused, on the other hand, by the hierarchical structure of the church politics. The section of the most of the Korean church consists of the elderly or older persons who mostly retired from their positions. They don't have any influential position in society. They only are particular about the small minor issues, typo in the weekly bulletin, something like that. The Korean church has long been separated from the Old Testament prophetic books because it relied on dispensationalistic and supersessionistic doctrines, whose core belief is that Christians need not take seriously Old Testament anymore because Jesus Christ fulfilled 100% all the legal requirements of the Old Testament. This is supersessionism or replacement theology. It may be referred to in other ways. So, Korean church actually separate the Old Testament from New Testament itself by rejecting Old Testament generally useless, valid, not valid anymore for Christian ethics and the social life. So, I'd like to the discussion of the ideal tension, ideal relationship between church and society by looking at current issues of the Korean church. The paramount concern of the socially healthy religion, in my opinion, to transform an unjust and inhumane, of a competitive and self-destructive society into a more communitarian society, sustainable society. I do believe any religion may serve as a supporting ideology for either preserving the status quo or curative social transformation. The early Korean Christian movement for national independence from the Japanese colonial regime may be contrasted with the contemporary Korean Christianity, particularly a majority of the mega churches in Korea. One is for resistance against the status quo. The other is for submission to the status quo. From the period of establishment of South Korean government under the leadership of President Lee Seung-man, a Methodist Protestant Christian, through the Korean War to the present time, the Korean church aligned itself with those people who hold anti-communitarian stance, freely welcome even neoliberal and over-competitive ideology. In essence, in truth, the church is called to exist for others, because it is the body of Christ given to the world. As bread and drink of life, Jesus Christ's self-sacrificial death has opened a way for enlivening the world. The Korean church, nevertheless, failed to perform a prophetic role in two ways. The Korean church has failed to criticize the ruling elite and upper classes on behalf of the weak, the marginalized, and the oppressed. It also has failed to sustain those people who are deprived of all human rights and dignity. The failure of the Korean church has to perform a prophetic ministry after the 1997 to 1998 IMF crisis. I want to look at more closely post-IMF crisis Korean society. Because the failure of Korean church to play prophetic roles has become conspicuous at this particular period. The 1997-1998 IMF crisis struck Korean society, as I mentioned, at the very bottom. It brought about disastrous consequences for Korean people, hence a variety of socio-political ills. The disintegration of a family, large-scale layoffs, rise of the suicide rate, of competition in job searching and college entrance, especially rates of suicide and divorce and unemployment all rose while the marriage rate declined, which is painfully the case with the nowadays young woman. The Korean church has not produced any constructive proposals for healing the socio-economic ills of a Korean society, has not stood in the gaps between the haves and have-nots, a central message of Christian social ethics. I have analyzed all the Old Testament related articles contributed to the Journal for the Korean Old Testament Studies from 1997 to 2007, 11 years. I have analyzed 217 articles. Only 34 articles of those 217 were written about Old Testament prophetic voices. However, on a close look at those 34 articles, it is safe to say that only 4 articles of 34 articles are regarded to deal with socio-economic justice of a prophetic voice in relation to contemporary issues of Korean society. So, Korean society, Korean theologian, Old Testament biblical scholar have not produced any constructive all-embracing, comprehensive proposal for healing the socio-economic ills of Korean society has not stood in the gap between the haves and have-not. Private enterprises, major corporations, state, and even church meant nothing to many IMF victims and casualties. Conscience, compassion, civic consciousness are quickly lost in public realms such as economy, politics, and social life. Conclusion. I will talk about how to transform the Korean church into a prophetic voice dominant church, which will be serviceable to the transformation of a Korean society. Before embarking on my proposal, I'll mention the consequences of the consistent failure of the Korean church to listen to the Old Testament prophetic voice. Korean society is suffering from the destructive consequences of the rapid economic growth that was achieved these past 5 decades, because it has not sufficiently built up a network of social care and welfare for outcasters and victims formed in the process of a capitalistic neoliberal market expansion in Korea. The GDP growth of Korea has been accompanied, naturally, by a widened divide between the rich and poor. Ruling groups of Korean society, represented by both state and major corporations, controlled by the foreign capital, which invaded the Korean economy since the IMF crisis, will continue to enforce a neoliberal and market totalitarian ideology in even the ostensibly public realms, such as public education, public health, public energy supply systems, public transportation, etc. A more neoliberalized and over-competitive Korean society will produce numerous victims, such as the underprivileged, job market outcasters, nomadic job seekers, the undereducated, etc. How can the Korean church be resourceful for transforming this dismal, gloomy society into a more just, peaceful, free, and communitarian society? One proposal will be mentioned: a more social state, as well illustrated in the chapter 13, Thomas Piketty, 20th Century Capital, democratically regulated state intervention, and social intervention for reducing inequality in wealth and income. A kind of more social state will be conducive to creating a more just, humane, free yet communitarian society, I trust. However, there should be more than state convention. I trust the Old Testament prophet books provide inspiring instruction for overcoming an inhumane neoliberal and market totalitarian ideology, and also for creating a more just and humane, free yet communitarian society. The biblically envisioned ideal society guarantees both freedom and equity, individuality and societal solidarity. However, the Old Testament prophetic books do not command or encourage state intervention through high-rate progressive income tax or global annual tax but communitarian, voluntary, mutually self-forgiving endeavors to sustain the weaker members of society. In this sense, I am not in agreement with Thomas Piketty's proposal for creating a social state. Neoliberal capitalism will be more or less transcended in a more peaceful and more lasting way by self-giving, sometimes even self-sacrificial, and a mutually sustaining communitarian brotherhood and sisterhood of citizens, namely Christian neighborly love. The more Korean church takes heed of the Old Testament prophetic books, the more resourceful it will be in contributing to the establishment of a harmonious and cooperative, free yet communitarian society in Korea. Korean church should develop, at this point, a way of making prophetic sermons for the larger audience beyond the Sunday morning service attendant, because all the prophets proclaimed their divine message to the entire people of Israel, and their goal was not merely religious, such as making people more pious and submissive, but society reforming and nation renewing. At this point, it is very important to emphasize prophetic comforting. What I mean by prophetic comforting is as follows. Prophetic comforting meant consolation for the afflicted through their vindication and judgment of the oppressive powers. This is very important factors. Isaiah chapter 40, 1 through 11, well exemplified how and in what sense Old Testament prophets comforted the people of Israel. A prophetic sermon should be bifocal, targeting two layers of audiences. One is called to the repentance, the other to the vindication and consolation. But most Korean pastors tend to have only one audience in mind. They make every effort to console the entire congregation, not having a divisive attitude. However, Old Testament prophets have a tendency to be divisive in delivering too targeted message. A prophetic sermon should be bifocal, targeting two layers of audience. One layer is called to repentance. The other is called to the vindication and consolation. This is kind of what I mean by prophetic sermon. Prophetic sermon may sound, in a sense, divisive, isolationist, or some separating the congregation into the two groups. One of the most effective ways for the Korean church to render service to the larger society is to proclaim prophetic sermons in order to inspire their audience to construct a sustainable society full of justice, equity, freedom, communitarian brotherhood, sisterhood. This is what I'm talking about at this moment. I think I am done with my presentation as planned. I think question and answer session are ordered. Any comment? Any questions?
If you have any question or comment, feel free to say. Go ahead.
Korean percent and 20% of the Korean. 20%, yeah. 20% of the Korean, entire Korean people.
So
Protestant, 20%. Including Catholic, 26%, approximately.
and 26.
That is late 19th century. Late 19th century, less than 1% for Korean entire population. They were very prophetic and social transformative in comparison to the contemporary Christian. Even though the Korean Christian formed 26% of the Korean entire population, they do not voice any prophetic voice against societal issues, economic injustice issues, political injustice issues, something like that. Yeah.
When you say Korean church, you mean all the Christian churches in Korea?
I mean Protestant church. Yeah. I have already submitted my entire full lecture to the NAM Center. You may have access if you have a further concern. Many footnote commentary provided at the footnote. Since I have a limited time, I don't have a time to make a full presentation of my just preparation, statistics, something like that. Many statistics, many detailed information are provided at the footnote.
I think one of the things your lecture didn't point out is a lot of things that Dr. Martin Luther King pointed out.
Yeah.
In his
Very
letter to the
similar. That's right. Especially a letter from Birmingham. Yeah. Just my voice at this time is very reminiscent of the voice made Martin Luther King in his letter from Birmingham, as you may have read. Yeah.
In the context of U.S. Christianity, people in churches that advocate for voluntary contribution to society,
Yeah.
ironically tend to come from churches that are increasingly doing less and less social justice work.
Yes.
So in the public sphere, they're advocating for there to be less mandatory taxation,
Yeah.
and saying in the public sphere that this should come from churches. But at the same time, the contributions that their churches that they're a member of are making to social justice work is increasingly getting smaller and smaller. So how would you deal with that?
That is very paradoxical phenomenon.
Yeah,
Right.
paradoxical phenomenon.
The more church expand their effort at the social charitable activity, the less concerned the church is with establishing and expanding social justice. I think there should be a solution to that kind of paradoxical issues. I think one, charitable activities, voluntary service for the afflicted people, such as IT people, kind of a social welfare or social service. That is not enough to perform prophetic roles. Prophetic role should go beyond some charitable activity, isolated charitable activity, beyond to the realm of a social activistic voice out, something like that, pointing to the injustice, pointing to the crime sins of the upper classes of a ruling elite by endangering himself or herself. This is kind of should be supported by the Holy Spirit. One cannot do by himself or by herself. Under the just a nearly compulsory push-up of the Holy Spirit, we Christians should go beyond just a social, charitable, socially accepted charitable activity to the prophetic against injustice. wrongdoings committed by the ruling elites and the power upper classes. Yeah, sometimes a conservative church kind of show up their social concern by advertising their voluntary activity or just their the amount of offering for the afflicted people, instead of going beyond to the very dangerous point, pointing to the just a very foundational issues of social injustice and political injustice. I think pastors, any pastor should be theologically well informed and well trained enough to deal with this kind of rift between social welfare activity and the social activity, prophetic activities. Yes.
I think one of the reasons that Korean church is separated from social participation
Mm.
is, I think, theological background.
Yeah.
Like millennial view is different. Each church.
That's right.
I think most Korean church have a pre-millennial view.
That's right. Yeah.
What do you think about the millennial view related to this social participation?
I think I am total in agreement with your just opinion. Korean church is over dependent upon premillennial kingdom perspective, which means all the secular issue, all the political injustice, environmental issue should be reserved for Jesus Christ's second coming. We don't need to intervene in those secular issues. Why? Those thorny issues, politically critical issues such as nuclear power, environmental waste, these kind of issues should be dealt with only by Jesus Christ when he comes again. This is kind of a ill-guided premillennial perspective of the future. I think C.F. Haley, Carl Ferdinand Haley, has written a book about these issues. Uneasy, uncomfortable consciousness of modern evangelical, such as a small book written about that issues. He argued that in their books, in order to participate in this kind of socially critical issues, we should get rid of such a ill-guided pre-millennial kingdom perspective and develop many ways of involving ourselves in those kind of issues. Yeah.
So I think Korean people from the Joseon dynasty now, Korean people have been suffering from theology battle, and the main theology you mentioned is liberal and free markets like that. I don't think they came from Bible. I don't think they came from Bible. So what I wonder is, so why did Korean church adopt that main ideology?
Okay.
Because they don't.
What is the historical background for the predominance of anti-communitarian stance in Korean church? Is that your question? What is the historical or theological background for the predominance of mainline churches holding such anti-communitarian stance, something like that? One answer would be as follows. I think the Korean War has been instrumental for the predominance of anti-communitarian ideological stance in Korean church. Why? Majority of Korean Presbyterian church come from North Korea. they had a real experience with the communists in terms of their cruelties and brutalities. So, Korean church from North Korea advocate anti-communion ideology on behalf of the Korean church in general. From the Korean War, early 1950s, Korean church has been unilaterally influenced by the anti-communitarian ideology, just in which the Youngnak Church, Chungyen Church, Samunan Church played a significant role in shaping such an anti-communitarian ideology for the Korean church in general. Also, the second answer would be as follows. The Korean church has vividly witnessed the unexpected collapse of USSR and its Eastern Bloc's allies. Unexpectedly. They are so convinced that communist status collapsed under the divine judgment. Free market ideology and capitalism will continue to upper hand such a materialistic communitarian ideology and status. Under the guidance of Francis Fukuyama, many Korean conservative Christians just hold such an ideological justification at the just site of the just collapse of the USSR and its Eastern Bloc allies. I think the second answer would be that way. Okay. Question.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one is, how significant is not only Christianity but religion itself in the Korean society? Because, for example, here or in some countries, religion is the basic fabric of the society. So it does impact on how the society reacts to what the churches or religious institutions bring to in terms of their ideologies. That's one. The second one is how connected the churches are to the state power.
State power. Okay. A second question is clear. Would you mind clarifying the first question? Because
How significant is religion in the daily life of the Korean society?
okay, I think I have added some footnote in response to your questions. Okay, but I wanted to add some comment to your first question. Korean people's three major religions are Buddhism, Confucianism, and Christianity. Buddhism kind of has dominated and 1 million Korean people in general. Confucianism, half a millennium, 500 years. The failure of the two traditional major religions, Buddhism and Confucianism, has become clear. At that very moment, there appeared Christian religion. Christian religion was faced with two dangerous, two critical moments. The dismantling of a Korean traditional village into kind of a industrialized era. Two traditional Korean religions are very instrumental, resourceful for social cohesion in some way. After industrialization period of Korean people, most of the Korean people, half of the Korean people, majority of Korean people lived in metropolitan and urban cities. That means urban residents are usually come from rural village. They are connected with the traditional clan, village, and traditional religion itself. So they are lupis homini. They are potentially hostile to each other, urban people, urban cities resident. in that case, Korean Christianity should have been more resourceful in social cohesion of such isolated village people into a new model of a communitarian village. In that task, Korean church has failed. I do believe. That means Korean church has a very little effect on the shaping of daily life of Korean people at the very bottom. That is not the case with Islam or Korean traditional Buddhism or Confucianism. At least it may say to say that two Korean religions, Confucianism, Buddhism, has influenced the Korean people at the very bottom of their daily life. I think it will take many years or many centuries for Korean church to be resourceful, to be useful, to be valid, to be relevant to the new fabric of daily life. That is my answer. Your first question or second question? Okay, second question. I don't remember your second question. Okay, yeah. Yeah, usually, okay. That is very easy to answer. Most of the Korean churches are state worshipping Christianity. You understand? Why? State is kind of a major protection source for Korean individual. State usually has been regarded as an agent of a divine protection for Korean people. So I have added some comment. Mega Korean churches, some mega churches in Korea raising national flag side by side, flag of a cross. That means they come nearly to a state worshipping Christianity. I'm very worried about that. So, but only less than 10% of Korean Presbyterian Protestant church are feeling the tension, state worshipping Christianity and God worshipping Christianity. 10%, I am included in 10%. I feel the strain, I feel kind of a very strong tension between two groups. I added some comment. Please be sure to check with my comment. Okay.
Regard to her question of the state influence, the last president, President Lee, was Presbyterian, and his church is Soma Church, and that church had about 70 high-ranking officials, had more than 100 vice presidents in various conglomerates. I say high-ranking officials as like level of lieutenant secretary level in government. So those Presbyterian megachurches are very influential, and I guess they are themselves the ruling people in those cases. But the thing is that the president before was the Buddhist, and Buddhists, namely the Joge denomination, had a lot of power. Now the president is Catholic, so Catholics gain influence. So my question to Dr. Park is that you know that you just mentioned that the traditional religions had a lot of cohesion for the local people, but because of that, the Koreans have very regionalistic viewpoints and very strong conflicts when we come together as a nation. So what will be your alternative or solution to this overcoming this divide and having social solidarity? Because so many Protestants are against ecumenicalism, among the religions and like that.
I don't think the presence of three big religions in Korean society is a problem. I don't see any tension between or among three Korean major religions. So I don't see any reason, any reason for Korean church to expand their effort to bridge the just gap between the religions. What is really at the stake is that they are just social, economic, political interest conflict each other regardless of their religions. What is at the real stake is not difference of religion, but difference of income, wealth, social status, ideology. So what I'm trying to overcome is to overcome the difference between the religion or among religion, but the rift or gap between socially, politically, economically marginalized group and just a ruling elite, upper classes. This is more fundamental issues for me. So any institutionalized religion with its power at the center of the constitution is very likely to be ally of a state. From my experience. So 조계종 is no exception. 조계종, the headship of 조계종 always is likely to be ally of a Korean state, Korean government, whether it be conservative or progressive. So that means I'm not sure whether institutionalized religion will be conducive to the overcoming the inequality difference in Korean people. Okay. Okay, please.
I have two questions. My first one is there any other country or the church of another country that is benchmarkable that the Korean
Okay. Oh, okay.
And my second one is many Koreans, especially non-believers and non-Christians, criticize the Korean church. But if the Korean church adapts a prophetic voice that has a big role in social-economic justice, would that change the perspective?
Absolutely, I'm positive about your second question. Yes, that is a statistically proved factor. The more the church expand the effort to play a prophetic role in society, the more numerical growth the church will achieve. That is the case with the Roman Catholic Church in Korea. Roman Catholic Church has grown, numerically speaking, from 2 million to now 5 million. Especially, Franciscus Pope is a superstar in Korean young men and young women because of his social political voice against any kind of injustice and social political issues. First question, I'm not sure. Is there any benchmarkable? I think I might say that very earliest stage of Korean, very earliest church, very earliest stage of Korean Christianity, that would be Adventist, a benchmarkable church. Also, the very earliest stage of world Christianity, from Jerusalem church to the 4th century church fathers dominated church. That would be their benchmarkable church. There is no contemporary church which will be benchmarkable church at this point. Especially Gerhard Ropping has written a book, kind of a socio-political dimension of Christian faith, which is substantially a commentary on Sermon on the Mountain. He has mentioned the church before medieval period should be benchmarkable. Yeah, I just find myself in agreement with Gerhard Ropping at that just comment.
Any other?
What would be your live in like daily life. I think your message sounds like more for like preachers, like pastor in the church, but to raise the prophetic voice as an individual.
First of all, you should take heed of the Old Testament books. You should be very familiar with the Old Testament book, especially with regard to what's going on in the 16 Old Testament books, from the very beginning, Isaiah to the 12 minor prophet. You should get very familiar with the Old Testament book in terms of their central message, and then you should develop a way of applying Old Testament message to your daily life, making them relevant to the modern issues, something like that. And you should just organize some groups with just a prophetic agenda in your prayer topics at the very top. You should be prophetically summoning to each other, which will be eventually inspiring to your pastors, to your session, to your synod. Okay.
So you said right now in Korea you would say there's a 10% that actually is to some degree living out this idea of a prophetic voice?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, who are those people?
I had added some food in your just potential question. I myself include, I am very sure, my wife is included, I'm sure.
I mean in terms of churches.
Yes. Okay, yeah. I would like to classify it. 80% of Korean Christianity is Presbyterian. 10% of the Korean Christian is Methodist Church. The rest of the sectarian church will form the rest of 10%. I think Gijang means a kind of a socially oriented Presbyterian church. Gijang, Christian. I have just commented on that division of a Korean church classification. Some progressive Presbyterian church, some Methodist Korean churches, some Anglican church, in conjunction with some Catholic priests, clergymen, are supposed to form the 10% or little bit more than 10% of a Korean church. In my estimation, people say that. This is not just my own idea. People say that. Yeah, I think so. This is the way I do feel. I do think about the Korean church in terms of social engagement. I am very positive because I have been long involved with the social issue. I have been very much responsible starting a journal entitled Gospel and Context, especially geared for Christian young men and young people, young men and young women, to just awaken Korean people, Korean young men and young women to social issue. I think about 20 years ago, just we started a very humble start. But now, about 5,000 young Christian leaders or potential leaders are guided by that journal. I'm sure that. So I'm getting much more hopeful and positive about the future of Korean church. As long as we stay tuned to the prophetic voice, being allowed Old Testament books. Okay. I hope your question is last.
As when I was young, I learned that from my parents and church leader, the most important thing is to be saved. I praised Jesus Christ. So when I was young, I thought that salvation is the most important, and I don't care about the social participation as a Christian. So I want to change the mind, and I want to know
I'm very sure you are very eloquent Korean speaker, Korean reader, right? I recommend my own books to you. First of all, I have written dozens of books about on that same issues. I have produced many commentary on Isaiah, Book of Daniel, Book of Acts, and Gospel of Mark, something like that. All the books go in same directions. How to make Bible socially relevant to social justice issues. I think I have developed many ways of applying biblical message to the societal issues. I am renowned for that very reason, I think. I'm getting much more renowned because I have, all the more I have expanded my whole effort in that directions. Am I glorifying myself? Sorry for that. It sounds like a self-glorification comment. I'm sorry for that. Bear with me for a moment. No further question?
Any other questions? So what we'll do is that if you contact the NAM Center, which info
ckс.info@unich.edu. That's on our flyers.
Yeah, so if you email and ask, request a list of books that we provide, scheme that we provide on this. Also, we have this full text of this lecture.
That's right.
Including footnotes.
Yeah.
With all the statistics.
Many footnote, yeah.
Yeah, we will provide the full text to anybody who wants to get a copy. So please email us and we will provide all.
One thing to add, this is my full lecture. It's got oral presentation geared lecture, not just a contribution to the journal, contributory type, okay? Just be understanding of this situation. But just you have access to my full lecture. Okay, you may email me if you have further questions so that we might develop our contact with each other, friendship with each other. Okay, I might be have time to respond to you. Thank you very much for listening and paying attention to my humble lecture and raising questions. Thank you very much again.
So Prophet will be